The galactic trade hub hummed with life as thousands of beings moved through its corridors, their voices creating a symphony of languages that the universal translators worked tirelessly to decode. Ships from 100 different worlds docked and departed in careful choreography, bringing goods and people from every corner of known space. Among the crowds walked humans, their peculiar two-legged forms weaving between towering stone giants and floating energy beings with practiced ease. Commander Kyle Harrison stood in Negotiation Bay 7, his hands gesturing as he spoke with clicking mandibles in satisfaction, a Vrix merchant whose insectoid body clicked and chittered in their native tongue. The translator rendered his words into smooth English, and Kyle smiled at something his friend said. They had done business together for 3 years now, and what started as commerce had become genuine friendship. Lieutenant Amy Chen sat at the communication console of their ship, the Wanderer's Hope, monitoring dozens of channels as human vessels across the sector reported their positions and status. Everything was normal, routine, just another day in the endless dance of galactic trade and diplomacy. Then, without warning, Kyle stopped speaking mid-sentence. His eyes went blank, his body utterly still. Amy's hands froze over her console. Across the station, every human being stopped moving at precisely the same instant. Clicking mandibles tilted his head in confusion, his antennae twitching as he tried to understand why his friend had gone silent. He clicked a question, then another, but Kyle simply stood there staring at nothing. On the bridge of the Wanderer's Hope, the other crew members found Amy sitting motionless, her expression empty. Within seconds, alarms began sounding across the station as 847 human ships went dark simultaneously, their communication systems falling silent without distress calls or warnings. Station control tried hailing the vessels, but received only the soft hiss of dead channels in response. At first, the other species assumed it was a technical problem, some strange malfunction affecting human systems. The probability of synchronized failure seemed impossible, but what else could explain it? Council Representative Zephon, a methane-breathing Kalrathi whose body existed as a cloud of conscious gas, called an emergency session within the hour. Representatives from the major species gathered in the Great Chamber, their confusion evident in 1,000 different forms of body language. The Vrix delegation reported that all human traders had simply stopped responding. The Aquarian diplomats confirmed the same from their water-filled embassy. Even the Eternal Ones, ancient beings who had seen civilizations rise and fall, had no explanation for what had happened. Clicking mandibles refused to leave the docking bay where the Wanderer's Hope sat silent and cold. He sent hailing messages every hour, his clicking voice carrying worry and fear, but received nothing except his own words echoing back through empty channels. Other species began reporting similar experiences across the galaxy. Human colonies had gone silent. Research stations no longer answered calls. Diplomatic outposts were dark. Every single human in known space had simply stopped communicating at the exact same moment. The Council dispatched investigation fleets to human territories, hoping to find answers. What they discovered was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. On New Olympus, a human colony of 50,000 people, the investigators found a ghost town. Meals sat half-eaten on tables, the food still warm. Children's toys lay scattered in parks where games had been abandoned mid-play. Personal belongings filled homes and apartments. Clothes in closets, pictures on walls, everything exactly as it should be except for one terrible absence: the people themselves. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, no evidence of any kind of violence or disaster. The humans had simply vanished. Scalekeeper Tom, a Saurian investigator known for his methodical approach, examined the Wanderer's Hope personally. The ship's systems were all functioning perfectly. Life support maintained comfortable temperature and atmosphere. Engines were ready for departure. Food stores were fully stocked. The crew's personal items remained in their quarters. Commander Harrison's coffee cup still sat on the command console, half full. Everything was in order except that the crew had disappeared without a trace. Tom ran every scan available, searching for biological residue, energy signatures, anything that might explain what had happened, but found nothing useful. The humans hadn't died here. They had simply ceased to exist. Within 2 weeks of the disappearance, the galactic economy began showing signs of stress. Human traders had handled 34% of all intersystem commerce. Not because they dominated the markets, but because they possessed an unusual talent for finding arrangements that satisfied species who would normally never cooperate. A Draxus warrior clan that despised the pacifist Gaians would still trade with them if a human intermediary managed the deal. The energy-based Tellurians who found physical beings disgusting would accept shipments arranged by human contractors. Now those connections were breaking down. Species reverted to dealing only with their own kind, and the carefully balanced trade networks began to fragment. Dr. Nexus, a crystalline luminar economist whose body refracted light into rainbow patterns when she was agitated, presented her findings to the council. Without human intermediaries, trade disputes between historically antagonistic species had increased by 300% in just 2 weeks. Entire economic sectors were grinding to a halt as species refused to negotiate with one another. The Vrix hives reported supply shortages. The Aquarian collectives were struggling to obtain surface world goods. Even the mighty Saurian Dominion was feeling the strain as their export markets dried up, but the economic troubles were only the beginning. The Universal Translator Network, maintained primarily by human linguists and technicians, began experiencing errors. At first they were minor, small mistakes in grammar or context, but they grew steadily worse. A formal greeting in Draxus was translated as an insult to the avians. A trade proposal from the Vrix became a declaration of war when rendered in Tellurian energy pulse language. Communication between species became difficult, then dangerous. Zephon stood in the council chamber, his gaseous form swirling with distress as he studied the reports flooding in from across the galaxy. 2,847 member species made up the Galactic Council, but only now was it becoming clear how many critical positions humans had occupied. They weren't the largest species in number, or the most technologically advanced, or the oldest civilization, but they had woven themselves into the fabric of galactic society in ways no one had fully appreciated until they were gone. They maintained systems, facilitated communication, resolved disputes, connected species that would otherwise never interact. They were the glue holding everything together, and now that glue had dissolved. Clicking Mandibles sat alone in the docking bay, his compound eyes fixed on the dark viewports of the Wanderer's Hope. He thought about Kyle, about their conversations over the years, about the human custom of sharing drinks after successful negotiations. Kyle had learned to click in the Vrix language, had attended the hatching ceremony for Clicking Mandibles' offspring, had shared human music that the Vrix merchant found strange but somehow moving. He remembered Kyle saying once, "We're not special because we're better than anyone else. We're special because we genuinely care about understanding you, about learning what makes you different and finding a way to bridge that gap." At the time, Clicking Mandibles had thought it was just pleasant words, the kind of thing friends say to each other. Now watching his world begin to fracture without human bridges to hold it together, he understood that Kyle had been describing something essential, something the galaxy was only now learning to value properly through its devastating absence. 3 months after the disappearance, the galactic economy was in complete freefall, and the crisis had spread far beyond simple trade disputes. The Tellurian Empire, a proud civilization of energy beings who had mastered technologies that other species could barely comprehend, discovered that 60% of their critical infrastructure maintenance had been performed by human contractors, not because Tellurians lacked the knowledge or ability to do the work themselves, but because humans had volunteered for jobs that others considered beneath their dignity. Power stations on 17 Tellurian worlds failed within days of each other. Emergency systems came online too slowly, and millions of energy beings dissipated into the void before backup systems could stabilize. The Tellurian Council met in emergency session, their glowing forms flickering with rage and grief, but there was no one to blame except themselves for taking human help for granted. The Aquarian Collective faced an even more immediate crisis. 40% of their underwater colony cities lost contact with the central government. Investigation teams discovered that human engineers had designed the communication relay systems, linking the deep ocean settlements to each other and to the surface world. The Aquarians had never bothered to learn the maintenance protocols, assuming that humans would always be available to handle technical issues. Now the relays were failing, and entire populations were cut off, isolated in the crushing darkness of their ocean worlds. Millions faced starvation as food distribution networks collapsed. The telepathic bonds that connected Aquarian communities could not cross the vast distances between colony cities, And without the relays, they were truly alone. Trader networks that had spanned the galaxy for centuries fragmented into isolated spheres as species retreated into dealing exclusively with their own kind. The Vrix hives stopped receiving the grain shipments they needed from herbivore worlds because the grain growers refused to deal with insectoid species they considered disgusting. The stone giants could no longer obtain the delicate electronics they needed from the quick-fingered skyborn people because the two species communicated at completely different speeds and had relied on human intermediaries to manage their interactions. Everywhere across known space, the carefully balanced inter-system economy that had taken generations to build was coming apart. Judge Coordinator Ven, a floating consciousness from the nebulous courts, spent her days reviewing legal cases that stretched back 50 years. What she discovered made her wish she had never started the investigation. 78% of all inter-system legal disputes had been resolved through human mediators. Humans possessed a trait that other species found baffling. They could genuinely understand and advocate for perspectives completely alien to their own biology and culture. A human judge could understand why a warrior species valued honor over profit, why a hive mind considered individual rights meaningless, why a telepathic race feared privacy above all else. They served as translators not just of language but of fundamental thought patterns and cultural assumptions. Without them, the courts became battlegrounds. The warrior clans of Draxus refused to accept rulings from judges they considered weak-minded cowards. The pacifist consensus of Gaia would not recognize verdicts delivered by species they saw as violence-prone predators. Cases piled up by the thousands. Disputes that would have been resolved in days now festered for weeks and months. Some of these unresolved conflicts escalated to violence. Border skirmishes erupted in sectors that had known peace for generations. Ships were seized. Colonists were expelled. Blood was shed over disagreements that human mediators would have solved with a few days of patient negotiation. Chief Scientist Helix, a multi-brained cognitor whose intellect far surpassed any human, conducted a comprehensive analysis of galactic research output over the past century. What he found shocked him deeply. Human scientific contribution had never been the largest or most advanced. The cognitors possessed superior intellect. The Luminar had more sophisticated technology. The Eternal Ones commanded knowledge spanning millions of years. But 91% of major breakthroughs had come from cross-species research teams that included humans, or were led by them. Not because humans made the actual discoveries, but because they asked questions nobody else thought to ask, and they connected researchers from different species who would never have collaborated otherwise. Helix reviewed the case of Peter Grant, a human xenobiologist who had somehow convinced a Luminar physicist and a Draxus warrior philosopher to work together on seemingly unrelated projects. The three of them had produced the breakthrough in faster-than-light communication that had revolutionized galactic society 15 years ago. Helix had always assumed the discovery came from Luminar genius, but the records showed clearly that Peter had been the one to see the connection between Luminar energy manipulation and Draxus' philosophical concepts about the nature of space. Without Peter to bridge their completely different ways of thinking, the Luminar and Draxus would never have even spoken to each other, let alone collaborated. Peter Grant was gone now, and the research networks he had built were dying. Scientists across the galaxy were retreating into working only with their own species, and innovation was grinding to a halt. Admiral Cross, commander of the Galactic Defense Fleet, faced perhaps the most dangerous revelation of all. Humans had comprised only 2% of military personnel, a tiny fraction of the fleet's strength, but they had served in 89% of joint species units, the elite forces that combined the strengths of multiple races into something greater than the sum of their parts. Without human coordinators, these units became dysfunctional disasters. The lightning-fast skyborne pilots refused to slow down for the powerful but ponderous stone giant heavy infantry. The telepathic mind-weavers could not synchronize their mental networks with the emotion-deaf, void-born navigators. Unit after unit reported reduced combat effectiveness, communication breakdowns, and escalating conflicts between species that were supposed to be fighting on the same side. Worse still, ancient rivalries were resurfacing throughout the military. Species that had fought brutal wars for centuries before joining the galactic community were remembering old grudges. Human diplomats and soldiers had served as living bridges between former enemies, constant reminders that cooperation was possible and preferable to conflict. Without those bridges, hatred that had been buried for generations was bubbling back to the surface. Border incidents between the Saurian Dominion and the Avian sovereignty increased from 1 or 2 per year to dozens per week. Both empires began military buildups, positioning fleets along their shared border. Admiral Cross could see the trajectory clearly. They were sliding toward war, and he had no idea how to stop it. Through all of this, Clicking Mandibles remained at his post in the docking bay, waiting beside the silent wanderer's hope. He had returned to his hive world once, thinking he should be with his people during the crisis. But what he found there drove him back to the station. The Vrix economy had collapsed without human trade partners. Food was scarce. The hive's carefully maintained social order was breaking down. Young Vrix were forming violent gangs, fighting over resources in ways that would have been unthinkable before. Clicking Mandibles had tried to help, but he was a traitor, not a leader, and his people needed guidance he could not provide. He thought constantly about Kyle, reviewing his memories like precious treasures. He remembered the human explaining his philosophy of trade. It's not about getting the best deal for yourself. It's about finding an arrangement where everyone walks away feeling like they won something valuable. At the time, Clicking Mandibles had considered this approach foolishly generous, but he had humored his friend. Now he understood that Kyle had been teaching him something profound about how civilizations survived. You couldn't build lasting relationships on exploitation. You needed mutual benefit, mutual respect, mutual understanding. Humans had understood this instinctively, had practiced it in every interaction, and had somehow infected the entire galaxy with their philosophy, without anyone quite realizing it was happening. Now that infection was fading, and the galaxy was reverting to older, crueler patterns of behavior. 6 months after the disappearance, open warfare erupted between the Saurian Dominion and the Avian sovereignty over disputed mining rights in a sector called the Contested Reaches. Battle Commander Scales of Victory led the Saurian fleet with a cold satisfaction that troubled him even as he gave orders to fire. He had fought the Avians before, centuries ago in wars that had consumed billions of lives, and he remembered the hatred his ancestors had felt toward the bird-like species. Human diplomats had brokered the peace treaty that ended those ancient conflicts. Human observers had maintained the ceasefire for generations, their presence a constant reminder that cooperation was possible. Now they were gone, and the old hatreds returned with a speed and intensity that frightened him. It felt natural, instinctive right to be fighting Avians again, even though the rational part of his mind knew this war was pointless and destructive. Wing General Soaring Talon commanded the Avian forces with equal parts anger and grief. Her people had nursed their resentment for 200 years, feeling cheated by treaty terms that human mediators had convinced them to accept as fair. Without humans to maintain the peace, without their steady voices reminding both sides of the benefits of cooperation, the old grievances had come roaring back. The battle was devastating in ways that modern warfare was not supposed to be. Both sides employed weapons that had been banned by treaty, restrictions that had been enforced by human monitoring systems that no longer functioned, chemical weapons that dissolved scales and melted feathers, biological agents that targeted specific genetic markers, energy weapons that caused unimaginable suffering. Thousands died in the first engagement, and both sides prepared for escalation. Admiral Cross received reports of 14 additional conflicts erupting across the galaxy within days of the Saurian-Avian War. The Galactic Defense Fleet, designed and trained to protect member species against external threats, found itself powerless to prevent those same species from attacking each other. He sent messages to both sides pleading for restraint, but his words carried no weight. The fleet was a human creation in many ways, built on human principles of mutual defense and cooperation. Without humans to give it moral authority, it was just another military force, and nobody feared it enough to stop fighting. Billions of refugees fled the conflict zones and the failing economies, creating a humanitarian crisis that quickly spiraled out of control. The sanctuary worlds, peaceful planets administered by species dedicated to helping others, became completely overwhelmed. Coordinator Gentle Hope, a fuzzy empathic being called a tender, watched her world descend into chaos despite her best efforts. Her people had always worked alongside human aid workers to manage refugee situations. The humans had handled the complex logistics while tenders provided emotional support and healing. Now the logistics were falling apart. Refugee camps designed for thousands held millions. Different species packed together without adequate space or resources inevitably came into conflict. Food riots broke out when carnivorous and herbivorous species competed for limited supplies. Religious conflicts emerged when incompatible belief systems clashed in close quarters. A group of void-born refugees who considered silence sacred found themselves housed next to harmonic singers whose culture required constant vocalization. Violence erupted. Gentle Hope tried to mediate, but she lacked the skills that human social workers had possessed. She could feel the emotions of those around her, could sense their pain and fear, but she did not know how to translate that understanding into practical solutions. People died while she stood helplessly by, overwhelmed by the suffering she could sense but not prevent. The worst tragedy occurred when a refugee ship carrying 10,000 Aquarians was denied docking at 12 different stations. The Aquarians required specialized water-filled environments that were expensive and difficult to maintain. Nobody wanted the responsibility of caring for a species with such demanding needs. Human aid organizations had once handled such situations routinely, finding creative solutions and negotiating with stations to accept difficult refugee populations. But those organizations were gone, and the species that remained lacked either the skill or the willingness to take their place. The Aquarian ship's life support systems began failing. The captain sent increasingly desperate messages begging for help, but station after station closed their docking bays and refused to respond. All 10,000 Aquarians died while thousands of beings watched from nearby stations, unwilling or unable to act. The guilt that followed the incident was overwhelming. But guilt did not bring the dead back to life. Dr. Memory of Ages, an eternal one who had lived for 50,000 years and witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, spent her days searching through the great galactic archive for answers. She was looking for historical precedent, any record of a species vanishing from galactic society the way humans had. The archives contained records spanning millions of years and thousands of civilizations. Surely somewhere in that vast repository of knowledge, there would be an explanation. What she discovered was both enlightening and terrifying. Humans were not the first species to serve as galactic mediators and bridge builders. 7 times in recorded history, a species had emerged with the unique ability to unite others, to serve as living connections between civilizations that would otherwise never cooperate. Each time such a species appeared, galactic civilization had flourished. Trade expanded. Peace prevailed. Innovation accelerated. And each time, after a few thousand years, that species had vanished without explanation. The records were fragmentary, damaged by time and the chaos that followed each disappearance, but the pattern was unmistakable. These unifier species appeared randomly, stayed for a brief period by galactic standards, then disappeared. Always suddenly, always completely, always without leaving any trace of where they had gone or why. Every time a unifier species vanished, galactic civilization collapsed into warfare and chaos. The recovery period took millennia. Countless beings died in the wars that followed. Technology was lost. Knowledge was forgotten. Eventually, new civilizations would rebuild from the ruins, and the cycle would begin again. Dr. Memory of Ages had lived through 2 such cycles herself, though she had not recognized the pattern until now. The disappearance of the unifiers had seemed like isolated tragedies, unconnected events separated by millions of years. Only now, seeing it happen again with humanity, did she understand that this was not random. This was a cycle, a pattern that repeated throughout galactic history. She presented her findings to what remained of the council. The chamber was half empty, many species having recalled their representatives to deal with domestic crises. Those who remained listened in growing horror as Dr. Memory of Ages explained what she had discovered. The implications were devastating. If this was a cycle, then it was not random chance or accident. Something was taking these unifier species. Some force or intelligence was removing them from the galaxy deliberately. But why? And more importantly, where were they being taken? Zephon, his gaseous form swirling with agitation, asked the question everyone was thinking. If this has happened 7 times before, and each time led to collapse and chaos, how did civilization survive? How did we rebuild? Dr. Memory of Ages' response was not comforting. Each time it took thousands of years. Billions died. Entire species went extinct. Knowledge and technology regressed. We survived but at a terrible cost, and now it is happening again. Scalekeeper Tom, still investigating the disappearance, made a breakthrough that same week. In a locked laboratory aboard a human research station, he found Professor Linda Brooks's final research notes. She had been studying anomalous energy signatures detected across human space 3 days before the disappearance. Her notes described a pattern, a signal of some kind reaching every human simultaneously regardless of distance or shielding. Her final entry, written mere hours before she vanished, was both cryptic and disturbing. "It's not a message. It's a call, and I understand now why we have to answer. Why we have to go. I'm sorry we can't explain because they wouldn't understand. But we'll make it right, we always do." The words made no sense to Tom, but they suggested something profound. Humans had known they were leaving and had chosen to go anyway. 9 months after the disappearance, Clicking Mandibles stood before a gathering of beings who called themselves the Rememberers. They came from 12 different species, representing dozens of worlds, but they all shared one thing in common. They had lost human friends or colleagues and refused to accept that those humans were simply gone. Clicking Mandibles had organized the group over several weeks, reaching out to others who felt the same desperate need to understand what had happened. Zephon had abandoned his council position to join them. Scalekeeper Tom brought his investigative findings. Gentle Hope offered her ship and her determination. Dr. Memory of Ages provided historical knowledge. Wing Commander Swift Descent, an avian pilot who had lost her human mentor, volunteered her skills. Engineer Facet, a crystalline being who had worked alongside human scientists, contributed technical expertise. Navigator Deep Current, an Aquarian who considered a human oceanographer her closest friend, agreed to plot their course. Together, they had one goal: find out where humanity went and bring them back. Using Professor Brooks's notes, they traced the energy signature to its source. The coordinates pointed to a region of space that humans had been quietly exploring for decades, never sharing their findings with other species. The sector was marked on human star charts with a single notation: the threshold. The Rememberers boarded a salvaged human exploration vessel they renamed Hope's Return and jumped to hyperspace, leaving behind a galaxy that was tearing itself apart. The journey took 3 weeks through space that grew stranger with each passing day. Sensors detected phenomena that violated every known law of physics. Time flowed inconsistently, speeding up and slowing down without pattern. At one point, the crew experienced the same hour 3 times, aware each repetition that they had lived through these moments before. Dr. Memory of Ages studied the readings with growing certainty. This is not natural space. Someone built this, or something did, creating a path that leads somewhere outside normal reality. They encountered derelict ships from the previous unifier species, ancient vessels from civilizations that had vanished millions of years ago. All of them were traveling in the same direction, all converging on the same destination. Some of the ships were so old that their hulls had begun to decay into dust, but their navigation system still pointed forward, still following a call that had summoned them across the ages. The Rememberers boarded several of the derelicts, searching for clues. What they found were fragmentary logs damaged by time but still partially readable. The crews of these ancient ships had been searching for their own lost unifiers, just as the Rememberers searched for humanity. When they finally reached the threshold, even Dr. Memory of Ages, who had seen wonders and horrors beyond counting in her 50,000 years of life, stood in speechless awe. It was not a planet or a structure or any kind of physical object. It was a wound in reality itself, a tear in the fabric of space and time that should not exist but did. Energy poured from it in colors that had no names, in wavelengths that their sensors could not properly measure. Scanning revealed the impossible truth. The threshold connected their universe to another dimension entirely, a plane of existence completely separate from the reality they knew. Dr. Memory of Ages accessed data from the ancient derelict ships, piecing together fragments of logs that had survived millions of years. Slowly, a story emerged. The unifier species did not disappear randomly or by accident. They were called, summoned by entities that existed beyond the threshold. These entities were fighting a war, an eternal conflict against something the fragmentary records described only as the consuming void. The beings needed help, needed coordinators and bridge builders and mediators to unite their forces against an enemy that threatened all of existence across multiple dimensions. They recruited species with specific traits: empathy, adaptability, the ability to unite different forms of consciousness. The Unifier species were conscripted to serve in a cosmic war that the rest of the galaxy did not even know existed. As Hope's return approached the threshold, they detected a transmission. It was weak, distorted by dimensional interference, barely perceptible but unmistakably human. The voice belonged to Amy Chen, Kyle's co-pilot from the Wanderer's Hope. The Rememberers worked frantically to enhance the signal, to extract meaning from the static and distortion. Piece by piece, they assembled her message. We didn't want to leave. We had no choice. The call showed us the truth. There's a conflict beyond our dimension, species fighting the void across realities. They needed coordinators and bridge builders to unite forces that can't understand each other. Humanity's purpose was never just in our galaxy. We're serving here now, doing what we do best but on a scale we never imagined. We can't return because the dimensional barrier only goes one way. Tell them we're sorry. Tell them we didn't abandon them. Tell them we're still bringing people together even if they're not people as we knew them. The transmission included positioning data showing millions of humans spread across dimensional battlefronts, serving as mediators between species so alien that they existed in different layers of reality. Clicking mandibles heard Kyle's voice in the background of the message, his familiar tone discussing relief efforts for refugees from a dimension where matter existed as conscious music. Kyle was alive, healthy, doing exactly what he had always done, helping others communicate and cooperate. He sounded tired but satisfied, like someone who had found their true purpose. The Rememberers listened to more fragments, hearing human voices coordinating supply lines between dimensions, mediating disputes between beings of living mathematics and entities of pure emotion, building alliances against the consuming void. Humans had not been taken against their will. They had answered a call to serve something greater than themselves. The crew debated long into the night about what to do with this information. They could attempt to communicate further, perhaps establish regular contact with humans across the dimensional barrier. But Dr. Memory of Ages warned that keeping the threshold open longer risked catastrophic damage to local spacetime. The wound in reality was growing, threatening to tear the fabric of their universe apart. They could attempt a rescue mission, sending a team through the threshold to bring humans back by force. But the dimensional barrier was one way, making this a suicide mission, and there was no guarantee that humans forced to return would still possess the abilities that made them valuable. The call that summoned them might have changed them in fundamental ways. Wing Commander Swift Descent argued passionately for honesty. The galaxy deserves to know the truth, even if it's painful, even if it means accepting that humans chose to leave us. Gentle Hope disagreed with equal passion. The truth will destroy what little hope remains. If people know humanity abandoned them willingly for a greater purpose, it will shatter their spirits completely. Better to give them something to hold on to. Zephon faced an impossible decision. The truth would likely accelerate the collapse, pushing species into despair and nihilism. But a lie, even a comforting one, went against everything he believed about transparency and honesty. Scalekeeper Tom offered a different perspective that changed everything. Humans didn't teach us to be honest above all else. They taught us to be kind, to consider the impact of our actions on others. Sometimes the kind thing is to let people keep their hope, to give them a reason to survive long enough to become strong enough to handle the truth. After hours of debate, they reached their decision. The Rememberers recorded everything they had discovered, every scan and message and piece of evidence. Dr. Memory of Ages encrypted the data and stored it in Hope's Return's memory banks with a time lock that would open automatically in 1,000 years. By then, she reasoned, galactic civilization would either have collapsed completely or grown strong enough to handle the truth. Then they made their choice to tell a lie, not a complete fabrication but a carefully crafted version of events designed to preserve hope. They would report that humans were alive but trapped beyond a dimensional barrier, working to escape and return home. They would frame humanity's absence as captivity rather than choice, as something done to them rather than something they embraced willingly. Before leaving, Clicking Mandibles sent one final message through the threshold, not knowing if Kyle would receive it through the dimensional interference. We understand now what you had to do and why you couldn't explain. We'll take care of things here until you return. That's what friends do for each other." For a long moment there was only static. Then a response came through, Kyle's voice barely audible but unmistakable. "We knew you would understand eventually. We always trusted you. We just needed you to trust yourselves and learn that you could stand without us holding you up." Hope's return turned away from the threshold and began the long journey home. Behind them, the wound in reality pulsed with energies from beyond their universe, a gateway to wars and wonders they could barely imagine. Ahead of them lay a galaxy desperately in need of hope, even if that hope was built on a beautiful and necessary lie. They arrived back at the Galactic Council's emergency headquarters to find civilization balanced on a knife's edge. 47 separate wars raged across known space. The economy had contracted by 60%. Billions had died from conflict, starvation, and infrastructure failure. The Council existed in name only, most member species having withdrawn to focus on their own survival. The Rememberers broadcast their message across all remaining communication networks. Clicking mandibles delivered the carefully crafted narrative with a steady voice, explaining that humans were alive, but trapped in another dimension by entities that needed their unique abilities. The message included Amy Chen's voice, edited to remove context that would reveal humanity's willing participation. Her words about serving and coordinating were framed as descriptions of captivity rather than purpose. "Humanity didn't abandon us," Clicking Mandibles announced to the listening galaxy. "They were taken from us against their will, and they're fighting to find a way home." The response was immediate and profound. Species that had been hours from launching final devastating attacks against each other stood down their weapons. The fighting did not stop immediately, but it paused, suspended by a sudden realization. If humans were coming back, they would expect to find a civilization worth returning to, not a burned-out wasteland of hatred and war. Suddenly, preparing for humanity's return became more important than winning battles or settling old scores. A movement began, spreading from world to world faster than anyone anticipated. The VRIX established centers where species gathered to share memories of human friends and colleagues. These centers became unexpected hubs of cooperation as species discovered shared experiences of human kindness, human patience, human determination to build bridges across impossible divides. Gentle Hope created what she called the Human Standard, a comprehensive documentation of every technique human aid workers had used to manage refugee populations and facilitate cooperation between incompatible species. Her people began implementing these methods, and to their surprise, they worked. Not as well as when humans did them, but well enough to make a difference. Wing Commander Swift Descent convinced both her government and the Saurian Dominion to establish a ceasefire, framing it as maintaining the peace until humans returned to mediate properly. The pause in fighting gave both sides time to recognize the futility of their conflict, to count their dead and question whether the disputed territory was worth the cost. What began as a temporary measure became a lasting peace as both species realized they had been manipulated by their own worst instincts. Engineer Fawcett led an initiative to restore the Universal Translator network using documentation left by human linguists. The work required cooperation between a dozen species, each contributing knowledge that humans had once synthesized alone. The network came back online slowly, more robust than before because now multiple species understood its operation instead of depending on a single group to maintain it. Scientists formed cross-species research teams awkwardly at first, trying to replicate the collaborative networks that humans had built so effortlessly. They studied human conflict resolution techniques, human ethical frameworks, human approaches to bridge building. They began applying these lessons independently, making mistakes and learning from them, gradually developing skills they had never needed while humans were present to do the work for them. Navigator Deepcurrent created schools teaching what she called human-style diplomacy, programs that spread rapidly across the galaxy. Thousands of young beings from hundreds of species studied how humans had approached problems, how they had found common ground between incompatible viewpoints, how they had convinced warring factions to see each other as potential partners rather than eternal enemies. The graduates were not as skilled as humans had been, but they were learning, and that learning was changing the galaxy in fundamental ways. 1 year after the disappearance, the galaxy had achieved something remarkable. The wars had ended. not through human mediation but through species learning to mediate themselves. The economy had recovered to 85% of its former strength, with new structures replacing systems that had depended on human participation. The council reconvened with full attendance for the first time in months, representatives arriving not because they were required to, but because they had remembered why cooperation mattered. Zephon addressed the assembly with words that acknowledged the painful truth everyone knew, but could not quite accept. We gather in humanity's absence, but we carry forward what they taught us. Every day we ask ourselves what humans would do in our situation, and every day we become a little more like them. The rememberers watched from the gallery, carrying the weight of their secret. They knew the truth that humanity was not coming back, that the dimensional barrier was absolute, that the cosmic war would continue for millennia beyond their comprehension. But the galaxy did not need to know that truth, not yet, perhaps never. What the galaxy needed was hope, and the rememberers had given them that precious gift. Clicking Mandibles returned alone to the docking bay where Kyle's ship rested. He had maintained it perfectly over the months, keeping every system ready for a return that would never happen. He spoke to the empty vessel as though his friend could hear him. "We're learning. Kyle, not as fast as you would have taught us, but we're learning nonetheless. The galaxy is healing, and we're becoming the people you always believed we could be." He paused, his antennae quivering with emotion. "You didn't abandon us. You taught us everything we needed, and then you trusted us to stand without your support. That was the final lesson, the hardest one, that we could survive and even thrive without you, that we had to learn to be our own bridge builders." 5 years after the disappearance, a new generation was being born across the galaxy. Wing Commander Swift Descent's daughter hatched, and she named the young avian Hope of Return, a name that had become common among dozens of species. She would grow up learning about humans as legendary figures, heroes who sacrificed everything to serve a greater purpose, and she would be taught that the highest calling was to embody human values of empathy and cooperation. Billions of young beings learned the same lessons, absorbing the mythology of humanity's noble sacrifice, never knowing that the truth was more complex and perhaps more beautiful than the legend. Humanity had not saved the galaxy by remaining present. They had saved it by teaching others to save themselves, then trusting those others enough to step away. In another dimension, Kyle Harrison coordinated relief efforts for species whose existence was so alien that they perceived reality itself differently. And sometimes during brief moments of rest he thought about his friend Clicking Mandibles and hoped that the galaxy he left behind was managing without him. And he believed that it was because humans had always had faith in the potential of others to rise to challenges and become more than they thought possible.